Well, it is the top of the hour, so good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Building a Security Exercise Program, or How to Use Security Exercises to Mature Your Information Security Program. This webinar is presented by ResearchSOC, the National Science Foundation Security Operations Center for Research. I'm your host, Todd Stone. Today's presenter is Josh Drake. Josh is a senior security analyst at the Indiana University Center for Applied Cybersecurity Research, or CACR. Over his 15-year career, Josh has worked in application support, project management, systems analysis, and network and systems administration across several industries, including municipal governments, energy, and healthcare. Now, let's take care of some housekeeping details. All the participants are on mute. You'll be able to ask questions, though, via the question and answer feature in your Zoom control panel at the bottom. And feel free to ask those questions. We'll collect those and address those in a Q&A session at the end. We'll have that, after that Q&A period, if we don't get time to address all of your questions, I would encourage you to ask those questions in our ResearchSOC community of practice at askcyberinfrastructure.org. I'll have a link to that at the end of the webinar. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording and the slides will also be made available on the ResearchSOC website. We'll send you an email when all those things are posted and ready to look at. With that, let's bring on today's presenter. Josh, please take it away.
Thanks, Todd. I want to just check and make sure our audio levels are good. Can you guys give Todd a thumbs up on the client there if you can hear us okay, or if we're not coming through, give us a thumbs down. Looking good?
So far, so good?
Okay. All right. Thanks, Todd, for the introduction. My name is Josh Drake, and I'm an analyst here at Center for Applied Cybersecurity Research at Indiana University. I work on a few different NSF projects here, ResearchSOC, which you're here for, as a project liaison. I also work with the Open Science Grid as a security analyst, where we run security exercises and operations for a distributed computing grid. And I am a contributor to the Cyber Infrastructure Center of Excellence Identity Management Working Group, where we are working to solve problems with identity management for NSF facilities. Today, our topic is building security exercise programs. So we will be talking up front about what security exercises can teach us. We will discuss some elements of successful security exercise programs, and we'll look a little more in depth at designing exercises to test different parts of your operational security. My slides are stuck. There we go. So, what are our goals as defensive-minded security professionals? We are in charge of protecting the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and access to our data. When we fail in that regard, we have incidents. Most of the time, our incidents are coming from places that we're not aware of. It's true you may have some situations where you're aware of a risk, you're unable to mitigate it for whatever reason, and you have some sort of loss due to that. But most of the time, we are having incidents stem from things that we're not fully aware of. This is what causes failure. Those things can be missing information about our own systems, inaccurate inventories, lost equipment, someone running code from the wrong repo, copying a test instance to production, something like that. Changing environments require constant vigilance. Sometimes we can have a failure or a breach in one area and not have compartmentalized our systems from each other well, and that leads to cascading failures in other areas. We have a single point of failure, so to speak. We might also have a sense or some sort of notification that something is happening, but our policies, procedures, or communication escalation doesn't really allow us to respond adequately. So perhaps a desktop technician finds something receives a ticket, indicates some sort of compromise, but there's no escalation protocol in place for him to pass that on to someone else and get a response started. And then sometimes we just have information that's imperfect. We think we know how something works. We set it up, we tested it once, and despite it being patched several times, we haven't gone back to revisit that. And so our systems, our people don't always behave in the way that we expect. One thing we can also suffer from is a myopia with our security systems. We designed the system. We can't think of any ways it's deficient, so it must be secure. But any person could invent a security system so clever that she or he can't think of a way to break it. And that is something we want to use security exercises to bring more eyes into our operations and change our perspective so that we have a better feeling of where our vulnerabilities may lie. So I mentioned earlier imperfect information. There's information we don't have, and then there's information that we think we know and it's wrong. That sort of information is oftentimes what gets us. Let's look at a couple different types of information that fits that paradigm, and we'll talk about ways that we can use security exercises to correct that. So what things do we know but we haven't tested? Systems that have changed, been patched, critical processes that we're introducing new components to, policies or procedures that we've written in a meeting somewhere and then not tested in practice. Inventories that we may not have actually verified against our actual equipment. We need to know what we have before we can secure it. If you have policies regarding inventory and change control, are you testing them? Do you have regular reviews for those sort of procedures, or do they sit on a shelf and not get dusted off very often? If those policies are being used, are they missing steps or oversights that could be creating gaps in your knowledge? Think of a few policies that your organization might have in place that might affect your response, and then ask yourself, how well do we know that these are being adhered to? Something like onboarding or offboarding your employees, move, add, change, hardware policies, software version control policies, or incident response plans all fall under this category. Next slide. So what is a security exercise? When I am using the term security exercise in this presentation, I'm referring to a large variety of activities we can engage in, but the key element is that they're designed to teach us something about our systems which we don't already know. We have a number of different types of exercises like this. We'll talk about them later. We have what you might think of as a traditional security exercise, red team versus a blue team in a live or simulated environment. We also have tabletop exercises for walking through policies and procedures, as well as evaluation exercises where we examine the information we have about our systems and test them for veracity. One of the key components of all these types of exercise is that they help us to learn something new or reveal a disparity in our thinking and our practices, and they get us to think about our security from a different perspective. Some security exercises have a positive feedback. We test something and it works the way we expect. Our people respond the way we anticipate, and that tells us that we're doing something well. A lot of times, security exercise will have a negative feedback where we test something and we don't perform up to the standards that we expect. And those are the most helpful because they let us go back and determine where we're failing and correct those. So how do we find out what we don't know we don't know? We use security exercises and we use them repeatedly. Just like you wouldn't go to a gym one time and consider yourself a fit person, you wouldn't run one security exercise and consider your security operations mature. We want our exercise program to be iterative. It needs to run regularly and improve upon itself. The frequency with which you run these exercises can be dependent on your resources and the size of your staff that you have available. But in general, I would say even the smallest organizations should run something quarterly to biannually. Organizations with a little bit more resources and personnel, I would shoot for somewhere between monthly and quarterly. And if you probably, not sure if anyone here would fall into this category, if you have a large amount of resources and personnel devoted to security, running daily to continuous exercises might be something you'd consider. So the point is that our security exercises should repeat and that we want to build momentum in a positive direction. We want to be testing things we didn't know about, finding new things, and then testing our improvement of our previous vulnerabilities. Some of the things that we are looking for here is to reinforce good behaviors when we find them. We want to correct bad behaviors when we find those. We want to inoculate our personnel to the stress of dealing with security incidents. And we want to improve the coordination, both our communication and our knowledge and reliance on the resources and documentation we have available. So what do you need to get started with an exercise program? You need a couple of prerequisites. You have to have some sort of written policy to adhere to. So if you're starting out and you have absolutely nothing devoted to security, you're going to need to create some sort of master document, master information security policy. That should probably include an incident response plan. It should define roles within your organization, and those roles are not dependent on individual persons, but you want to have roles dedicated to positions. So a responsibility assigned to a role and multiple people able to fill that role in your organization. You need to have some sort of inventory of what you're protecting. What are your hardware assets? What are your software assets? What are your data assets? What is your critical infrastructure? And then we also want to think about why we are protecting those resources and how. In the world I deal with, science, we are not necessarily concerned with confidentiality of all of our data sets because many of them are public, but we do need to make sure that we have full confidence in the integrity of that data. Availability may not be the highest concern, but again, we need to make sure that none of it has changed. In your organization, it might be different. You may have higher needs for availability or higher needs for confidentiality, but whatever it is, you should think about that and design your policies and your exercises around meeting those goals. I believe we have time for a poll now.
Yes, we do. Thank you, Josh. Great information. Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to understand a little bit more about your experience with security exercises. So I'm going to launch this poll, and you should be able to respond to that by voting your choice. And those results are coming in. We thank you for your participation. That's great. We'll leave this open for just another 10 or 20 seconds. We have a variety of levels of knowledge here, Josh. From folks who've never planned or conducted a security exercise to about a quarter of our audience have conducted several. I'll end this poll and let me share the results with you, ladies and gentlemen. There you can see how your other attendees voted. We just have about 10% who are never conducted or planned an exercise, with the vast majority of you participating in one or more but never having led the band on one of these. I'll stop sharing now and we'll resume with our presentation. Josh, back to you.
All right, thanks everyone for your feedback. I know from the registrations, a lot of people had some questions about how do you define or identify a successful security program. So we're going to talk a little bit now about some elements of what a successful program looks like. We have 4 key ideas that we've identified here: regularity, purpose and focus, preparation, and follow through. We'll talk first about regularity. So having a program that focuses on repeating exercises, not the same exercise, but a series of exercises that is designed and intentional, will help you to reinforce those behaviors we were talking about. Reinforce good, correct bad, and we want to catch those as soon as possible so that we're not allowing the sort of problematic behaviors to become ingrained in our systems or our personnel. We aren't trying to achieve some sort of victory condition. No, there's no real successful end state in defensive security. But we are trying to practice and iterate on this until it becomes almost impossible for us to fail. We want to make sure that we are holding these regularly so that we are rotating people through the program. We want people in different roles to fill in at different exercises so that not just our primary person, but their backup and even their backup all have a taste of what it is like to participate in an actual incident. We want to familiarize people with the resources that we have available for them, our policies, our procedures, tools, communication documents, and so on. We don't want our policies to just sit on a shelf to be dusted off whenever an incident happens. They should be documents that your staff is engaging with and looking at on a regular basis, and they should grow with your organization. Part of repeating our exercises regularly is maintaining those documents. And then finally, we want to have these scheduled regularly, and we do not want to schedule them around the schedules of our key people. So if your CISO is on vacation, that's fine. Schedule an exercise, because an incident isn't going to wait for them to come back from vacation, and your exercise shouldn't either. One thing that we want to think about when we're creating a program of exercises is the purpose and focus of our organization. We talked about it earlier in our prerequisites session, but one thing that's important is to know what you're securing and why. And when you go to build a program of exercises, keep that at the top of your mind. Determine what elements of your organization are most critical, and then think about how you can test them. So if you have a moment or a piece of paper and a pen, go ahead and write down maybe 3 of the most critical elements of what your organization does. We would use that list later on in the session to start thinking about what sort of security exercises we can design to test those things. Some examples I have listed here. You want to test for known risks that you think you've mitigated, looking for single points of failure, testing recently updated systems, and testing systems that you might know are vulnerable but want to bring light to. Some people asked in the registration questionnaire how you can get management to buy into your systems. Well, if management has certain ideas or certain projects that they find are valuable and think that these are central focuses of your organization, testing those systems and revealing their vulnerabilities can be a great way to get buy-in for this sort of a program. And then finally, remember the purpose of an exercise is to improve the future performance of your organization's information security program. You do not want your participants to come to an exercise afraid that their performance is going to be evaluated. It ruins participation in the exercise, and it reduces performance when people are too worried about if they're being evaluated or not. We want to be thinking about the future behaviors of our staff and systems, not evaluating them with the exercises. The third element of a successful program is our preparation. Someone needs to be at the wheel of a security exercise program. That might be a single person, it might be a security team, but someone needs to be steering it with the purpose and focus that we discussed above. Preparation is going to set the tone for how your exercise will run. Good preparation and clear communication lets the staff know that this is important. It's a serious endeavor, and it's worth their time, attention, and resources. Clear communications and scheduling also helps set the boundary of your exercise. You want your participants to know what is in scope and what is out of scope for a given exercise so that you can focus on getting the information out of the exercise that you're hoping to find. I've been in a few exercises where scope was not well defined, and so you can really run down a lot of rabbit holes in your system looking for something that is totally unrelated to what your facilitator intended you to get out of an exercise. So prepare your exercises well, set the scope, and communicate that. Another element you want to consider during your preparation is how familiar are your participants with your exercise program. When you're starting, you want to start small. Some simple exercises that can get people participating, build some confidence, and start seeing some results come out of those. But be planning ahead so that once you've got 3 or 4 of these under your belt, so to speak, you can go ahead and start challenging them with some exercises that they might fail on. If you're succeeding on 100% of your exercises, then you're not making them hard enough. You should probably be failing at least half of these exercises if you want to be efficient in gaining information from running them. We learn a lot more from failure in these security exercises than we do when everything runs exactly the way we expect it to. The final element of a successful program that I'd like to talk about here is follow-through. Security exercises do reveal a lot of incorrect thinking, imperfect information about our systems, but if we don't make any changes based on that information, we're not really maturing our operations. We're just learning information for the sake of learning. We want to make sure that every exercise has some sort of debrief element. Now, depending on what type of exercise you're doing, who participates, this can look quite different, but I would like to see sort of everyone who participates in a security exercise get together with their notes and discuss what happened during the exercise as soon as it's reasonably possible after the end of an exercise. Every exercise that you run should generate some sort of report. That report can be as simple as you want or as complex as you want, but it should have a few items that you can refer to when you come back to review them later. One is you want some sort of abstract of what was done and why. You want to have, in addition, a description of how the exercise was conducted, some sort of methodology, especially if you plan on repeating failed exercises later, and you should. And then you want to have your findings. What did you learn when you conducted this exercise? Finally, looking at especially failures, you want to make a list of changes to implement and give those to the appropriate people as recommendations. Another thing that goes hand in hand with writing the reports from an exercise is reviewing those reports regularly. One of the type of exercise you can actually do is review your previous exercises and see if your recommendations are being implemented. Document recommendations that are not being followed through with a reason why, and then make sure that you're updating your risk assessment or creating one if you don't have one every time you run an exercise that reveals some new vulnerability. And then tied together with reviewing and reporting is repeating failed exercises. Whenever you have an exercise that does not go the way you think it should, implement the recommendations that are gained from that exercise and then revisit it a few months later with a few small changes, just to make sure that the information the exercises are generating is being integrated into your personnel. And finally, treat every exercise as successful as long as you have learned something new. When you have a positive exercise and things function the way you think that they should have, that can really be pretty obvious how you can celebrate that. Everyone performed well, systems work the way we think, we can be confident that this area is not an area of concern in the immediate future. But when you have a failed exercise and your staff might come out of it thinking, wow, we really dropped the ball on that one, you want to make sure that they understand the purpose of the exercise was to find that shortcoming and fix it before it becomes a problem in a real incident.
Thank you, Josh. Again, great information. We really appreciate it. Ladies and gentlemen, let's have another poll. We'd like to understand the level of maturity in your security exercise or your information security program, and we want to ask you about a few key elements that you might have. So if you would please indicate those elements that you have in your information currently in your information security program, either have them in place or they're in process. And again, thank you for participation. Those responses are really coming in. That's super. That's super. Thank you very much. Well, I'll go ahead and end this polling in about another 3 or 4 seconds. And I'll share the results here. Looks like, Josh, the overwhelming majority of our attendees today have an inventory, a master information security policy, an incident response plan, that's great, 88%, and a security exercise program, about 35%, so almost 2/3 are probably looking to set one up. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing these results and we'll move on to the next slide. Josh, please.
Thank you. That's great news. Sounds like most of us will be ready to hear the next portion, which is talking about designing exercises to test policies and procedures you've already got in place. So it's great. It sounds like a lot of people have those already set up. So this next section, we're going to talk about 3 different types of exercises. These are not the only 3 types of exercise. These are the 3 categories that I feel most of the exercises that I run fall into. We've talked about how we want to have regularly scheduled exercises. We want them to iterate on our focus of our organization and our purpose. And we want to follow through and mature our organization's security practice with these exercises. So now we're going to talk a little bit about 3 different types of exercises that we can use to test various elements of our information security program. And we're going to talk about what sort of resources you need to run each one. We'll talk a little bit about some caveats with each type and what they're good at and what they're not so good at. Well, the first type of exercise is a tabletop exercise. I like to think of this sort of like playing Dungeons and Dragons, but for security people. We sit together at a table with pens and papers and a printout of our rules, right, our policies and our procedures, and then we walk through a hypothetical scenario using our policies and procedures to respond. And we ask the people in the roles that are participating, what do you do in this situation? We let them refer to their information security policy. We let them refer to the incident response plan, and we see sort of logically if our policies are working, if they make sense. These are excellent for using early on in a program where you may not have much more in place than just a central set of policies and procedures. They're great if you don't have a lot of resources because they really only require time. They require a moderator to spend some time thinking about what they want to test, how they're going to do that with some sort of pre-written outline or scenario, and they need the participants to have some time to communicate together in real time. You also are going to need a method for the participants to take notes and some way for them to communicate during the exercise and afterwards at your debrief. You also have to have a defined list of roles and responsibilities and have participants for all those roles in each case. What these are not great at is showing us fallacies in our thinking about our systems, especially with software, hardware, infrastructure. Because we're doing this all hypothetically, exercises in the mind, we are not going to learn if there's assumptions about our technology that are incorrect. So be aware of that if you're using tabletop exercises exclusively. The second type of exercise is really the type of exercise I find running the most. That's because it requires the least amount of participation from people outside of the security team. And these are evaluation exercises. And a lot of people probably don't even think about these sort of things as security exercises, but they definitely are a tool we use to reveal incorrect or imperfect information about our organization. This is basically passively gathering information about our systems, infrastructures, policies, documentation, procedures, anything that you have that's tied to your security practice can be evaluated in this way. The requirements can be quite small on the resource side. You need at least one investigator. You'll need some sort of tool or methodology for gathering the data. In a lot of cases, that is just going to be the investigator looking at different documentation and testing it against what's actually set up in your organization. But in some cases, you may need specialized tools. One type of exercise of this type is doing port scanning against your internet-facing ports. So you may need to set up a server with some sort of port scanning software. You can do this internally, externally. You might do an exercise where you send out an email to everyone on your security team contact list and just see how long it takes to get responses back from that email. Testing your communication, testing that your addresses in your communication documents are accurate, and making sure that responsiveness exists when you need to have a quick response in a security incident. So these are great for gathering inventory, gathering information about your systems or your organization, putting together or expanding, updating risk assessments, and verifying your documentation and resources that you are going to rely upon during a security incident are accurate and true in the way that you expect them to be. And then the final type we're going to talk about today is live exercises. And I think when we talk about security exercises, this is probably what a lot of people are thinking of. We're throwing some sort of curveball at our security team in a test or simulated production or sort of isolated production environment. The classic example is having a red team and a blue team, putting your attackers on the red and defenders on the blue, and let them sort of figure out the different surface areas of attack, ways to defend. You can also run these as a white team, the moderators versus a blue team, or the white team versus a red team, depending on what you're trying to focus on in that particular exercise. What you're going to need for a live exercise is at least 2 teams of participants, red versus blue, red versus white, white versus blue, purple versus purple. Just whatever you're trying to test will determine what teams you're going to have. You're going to need some sort of environment to run these tests in. That could be your test environment, it could be your production environment, some sort of simulated production environment, but these are going to be more effective if you can run them in an environment that is as close as possible to the actual environment that you are working to defend. These type of exercises, it is very important to have defined boundaries and scope, because you do not want areas of your security exercise running over into areas of your actual live production environments. You don't want people who are responsible for logging, system logging, stuff like that, to be unaware that these events are happening if you start generating a lot of strange log data. And then again, like a tabletop exercise, you want to have some means of note-taking and debriefing at the end of each exercise. These types of exercise are really good for reinforcing the human behavior or correcting human behavior among the participants. They are great for evaluating your tools and software that you're using. They're great at revealing assumptions that we have incorrectly held about the way our systems will function during certain types of incidents. And they're good at evaluating your critical infrastructure and hardware. So we've talked about building a program, we've talked about identifying critical areas of our operations to mature, and we've talked about a few different types of exercises that we can use to evaluate those critical processes. The final thing we want to talk about is designing and running an exercise. And I know this is a topic that a lot of you have interest in from our feedback at the sign up. And we may consider doing a full webinar just on designing different types of exercises in the future. Today, we only have a few minutes to talk about it, but I'll go through what I can, and there'll be some time for questions at the end. So earlier, I suggested if you had a pen and paper to write down 3 things about your organization that were critical. So when you design an exercise, start with one of those things, one of these elements that is critical to your operations. If you have one of those elements that is on that list, and it also has happened to recently have undergone an upgrade or changed the way that a workflow that it is involved in has been affected in some way, even better. Focus on what you're going to test first, and then choose a type of exercise that is going to allow you to test that aspect of your functionality. If you're looking at policies, a tabletop exercise is a great place to start. If you're looking at your inventory or your vulnerability assessments, right, you might want to start with an evaluative exercise. If you have all that stuff and you're relatively confident in your policies, procedures, and your inventories, and you want to see how your personnel are going to handle more complex incidents, maybe plan a live exercise and figure out how your staff responds if some element of your security controls suddenly disappears in a production or test environment. Once you know what you're testing and what type of exercise you're going to use, you can sit down and write an outline, what you want to learn, how you're going to present that to the participants, what methodology you're going to use, and as you also want to think about at this point what the boundaries and scopes are, and what resources participants are going to need to have to run the exercise successfully. Once you have all those things in a list, you can start developing them, pulling them in, making sure that the resources are available, and you can move on to the next part of this, which is running the exercise. Before your exercise even begins, it's important that you communicate the time and place in advance, and communicate even outside of the list of participants for that exercise. We don't want this to be surprising to people involved in our operations that aren't dealing with the exercise directly. And we don't want, we also want to have an awareness that testing our security operations is something that we are doing and is important. You want to clearly communicate before the start of the exercise the scope and boundaries, and then provide the resources that you identified during your design phase so that the participants have them readily available. A lot of times I think of this as things like, I want to have my incident response plan printed out, or I want to have all the different documentation resources gathered in a list that I'm going to give to my participants at the start of an exercise. Any sort of resources they're going to need. If you want your staff to sit around a table and do a security exercise in a live environment, make sure they have laptops, access to your network, etc. Plan all that stuff out in advance, provide it to your participants. Take extensive notes. Both yourself and all the participants should have a notepad or a digital notepad so that they can document their thought processes throughout an exercise, and make sure that you're recording timestamps when you're documenting what you did during an exercise. You can compare what so-and-so on red team was doing with what so-and-so on blue team was doing at the same time during the same point of the exercise. After the exercise, solicit feedback from participants. Find out what was successful at helping them think about policies, procedures, controls in a new way. Take notes from your own experience. What helped you learn the most from the exercise? What did you spend time on that didn't necessarily produce great information? And then iterate on that for the next time you run a similar type of exercise. And then the final part of conducting the exercise is the debrief. Get as many participants as you can together as soon as possible afterwards and debrief. I find it helpful to go in a chronological fashion, especially if we're doing a live exercise. But get that information and collect it in a central place as soon as possible afterwards. Less urgent than that is writing a report. Once you have that information collected from your participants, you can generate a report as time allows, but don't let those reports sit for too long, otherwise they'll actually never get published. I find that it's generally a great idea to be able to get my report out from an exercise before I run my next exercise. So if that's quarterly, you have a quarter. If it's monthly, you have a month, etc. If you're running daily exercises, you may not need to produce long defined reports. But until you get to that point, try to generate a report as soon as possible, and definitely before you're running the next type of exercise. And then make a list of recommendations. This is a great opportunity to think about when something goes wrong. Not just what was the immediate thing that went wrong, but what is the root cause in our systems that led to that failure. The higher, closer to the base, closer to the root we can address those things, the more potential problems we can solve in the future. And then again, I've said this already, but revisit your exercises. Make sure you are actually enforcing or implementing the recommendations and repeating your failures so that you can be sure you're retaining information that you gain when you run these things. And finally, we have a slide here. There's a shortened URL and a QR code for anyone who wants to scan that. This will take you to a list of example security exercises. These come from our colleague Susan Sons, who wrote an article for Linux Journal on running security exercises. There's about 20 examples here of different types of security exercises, from tabletops to live exercises that you can adapt for your organization. And they have some interestingly funny names as well, if you're in for the humor there. So.
Thank you, Josh. Absolutely great information. I'm going to go ahead and launch our last poll of the day. And earlier, Josh mentioned that we might be able to produce additional security exercise webinars on specific topics. So we'd like to gauge your interest on a webinar focused on a specific topic, or a larger one that would be emphasize designing all three types, or if you're just not interested. Well, thank you for your response. That's really quick. And those are coming right in. We'll give folks just another few seconds to respond. And we thank you for your participation. Just a couple more seconds. I'll go ahead and end polling, and I'll share the results. Josh, these people want everything.
Cool.
So we will take that under advisement. Look for those, perhaps look for one or more of those webinars here in the next few months as we build out our webinar schedule. But thank you very much. We'll move on then.
Someone is asking if we can post that link for the slides or for the list in the chat.
Yes, we can here in just a few minutes. So for now, we'll go ahead and move into question and Q&A. And there, John's has posted it. Thank you very much. You can also find it on the ResearchSoc website, researchsoc.iu.edu/webinars. That will get you to the webinars page. Scroll down to the information for this webinar. The link to that PDF is right there. So we do have a couple of questions. Josh, we did have a question, and Robin, I know you had a question. We have one in front of you, but we did have a question about which kind of security exercise you might recommend for somebody in a small program, small staff, just starting out.
Yeah, sure. So if I were building a security program from scratch and I wanted to introduce security exercises, we would look first at developing those central policies, having a master information security policy, and then having an incident response plan. And I think the first exercise I would run in that scenario is a tabletop exercise, just walking through an incident response plan, making sure that the roles, communication, escalation protocols are all ironed down. It's also a great example of just getting the security response team used to functioning in those roles and learning what their responsibilities are as they begin to participate in security exercises for the first time.
Okay, thank you. And Robin asked, for live exercises, are you referring to actually using test applications within the company, or actually having an environment that is set up for the exercise?
So both. It depends on the resources that you have available. Most often I am sort of working in an adjacent but as similar as possible environment. to a production environment. We do know of people that, I mean, there are lots of companies that run security exercises in their production environment, right? Netflix is sort of famous for having their chaos engineering where they are trying to break things in production. I don't necessarily recommend that for most people unless you are very confident in the resiliency of your systems. But I would say either a test environment that you have cloned from production, or if you can figure out a way to, if your exercise is scoped such that you can easily roll back any production changes that your exercise may introduce, you could run it in production. Or if you can clone your production environment specifically for a security exercise environment, then that's a great option as well. It's really going to depend on the resources and the sort of systems capability that you have at your organization. Michael, you should see that link just right above you there in the chat from John. It's the go.iu link.
And I posted the link in answer to Robin's question, since we answered that. What other questions do we have? Well, thank you very much for attending today. We'd like to ask you to make sure that you connect with the Research SOC. Please visit our website, subscribe to the announcement list. You can read our blog, but perhaps most importantly there, down next to the last, is visit askcyberinfrastructure.com and join our community of practice. You don't have to be a Research SOC client, and we do have several good discussions going on about securing cybersecurity for research that I think you'll find interesting and informative. Finally, of course, please follow us on social media. We always like to see people on Twitter and LinkedIn. We do have a couple of other webinars coming up at the end of February on SCADA and ICS systems. And if you have systems that have anything from telescopes to centrifuges, you'll be interested in this. We'll have more information on that coming shortly, but there's the date. And then a great webinar in late March on selecting and using operational cybersecurity metrics to make your program more effective. If you're going to be at any of the events on the right, EDUCAUSE SPC or PERC, please stop by. We'll have a table there and get a chance to know you and ask some of your questions. And you'll find information on that, all of that at researchsoc.iu.edu/webinars. We want to thank you again for your attention today and for your attendance. We really appreciate it. I see we're done with questions. So this concludes our webinar for today. We'll email you with links to the slides and to the video when those are posted. Thank you again and goodbye.